He was an MD medical doctor, studied up in Edinburgh, Scotland, and his mentor, who he worked under, was Dr. Bell. And Dr. Bell impressed Watson, as in Doyle,
Yes.
as his powers of observation. He'd have a patient come in, and by looking at the patient, he could give an almost total diagnosis.
Where he came from, how far he walked, the whole nine.
Yeah, and the medical aspect of that got his mind going on that,
Right.
and how to expand it. This would drive Dr. Watson absolutely bonkers. If he was bored, he'd inject himself with a solution of 7% cocaine to numb the mind or whatever. But if he was in a case,
Didn't need it.
didn't need it.
And Watson, he was.
Well, Watson, from hints in the stories, he was probably an alcoholic. He was a womanizer. He went through at least 2 wives.
Oh.
You know, but it's not highlighted, but there are those little hints.
Right.
At one of the conferences that the Norwegian Explorers puts on, the gentleman who was head of the Pennsylvania Blue Cross Blue Shield gave a paper explaining how Holmes and Watson were codependents
Oh.
and how they each would aid the other's habits. He led to some modern thinking about how to analyze. And as a doctor, you have a patient come in, you have to analyze the symptoms. Then from the symptoms, you have to do a process elimination to hopefully arrive to a
Correct diagnosis.
diagnosis. And when you eliminate everything else, whatever remains has to be the answer. Holmes finds clues about poisons from observing certain things on the victim. He finds clues. He wrote a monograph, a booklet on the characteristics of cigar ash, how to identify cigar ash. That's the kind of brain he had. And of course, he also was into bees.
He was into bees.
Yes, he's not retired. By the way, we can prove that Sherlock Holmes is still alive.
Oh, we can?
Yes. Anybody who is anyone in British society, when they die, the obituary is printed in the London Times. They have never printed his obituary, therefore he's still alive.
He must be alive.
He's retired down in Suffolk, he's a beekeeper, and our theory is he's using that royal jelly. That royal jelly is keeping him alive.
That must be it.
Yes.
All right.
Prove me wrong. There's a PBS program that's been on at least twice. It's entitled How Sherlock Changed the World. After the stories came out, it changed criminal deduction. It changed how medicine looks at things. They interview the head of a forensics lab in a major city, and she says she never goes to a crime scene without a magnifying glass. That's her first thing she uses.
I really think about the deductive reasoning and analysis that is required of a physician to make that correct diagnosis.
Yes. For example, one of the stories involved a dog that didn't bark at night.
Now, that's unusual,
Yes.
because most dogs do bark.
But that was a clue, yes. And
that was the clue.
So that made him think, okay, why didn't that dog bark?
You know, in fact, the beginning of the story of The Sign of Four.
Yes.
The first
story.
He meets Watson and he says, you are from the war.
You're a military veteran, wounded, you're in Afghanistan, and he rattles off a bunch of stuff, and Watson is just
Dumbfounded.
And then later Holmes explains, well, it's obvious, he says to him, or, you know, you had a deep tan, so you came from the tropics. Your demeanor showed you're probably military, probably an officer. And you walked with a limp, so I tell you you're probably wounded. And
that had got you off the war, and you've just...
Yeah. And so when he laid everything out, I said, oh, of course that makes sense. Of Sherlock, which is in modern times, Benedict Cumberbatch.
Yes.
And what's interesting is who'd have thunk, 100-some years after the stories were written, that the Brits would be back in Afghanistan and you'd have a wounded Dr. Watson.
There it is.